Hi, Haviv. Good morning.
Hi, Tom. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. Busy morning.
So, I'm here today with my friend Haviv Rettig Gur, who we've been close friends since 2005, when Haviv was actually still at university, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he just started as a junior editor and reporter at the Jerusalem Post. And I was immediately impressed when we met at the Herzliya conference by Haviv's perceptive points and wry remarks. And I always knew that Haviv would go on to great things in journalism, and he has indeed become, he became a senior writer and reporter at the Jerusalem Post, and now one of the most senior writers at the Times of Israel, and we're also close friends. So, what we're going to speak about today is Benjamin Netanyahu. It looks like Netanyahu's long career in Israeli politics may be drawing to a close any moment now. Or at any rate, I think that even if Bibi, as he's widely known, survives a little while longer, the sort of heyday of King Bibi is probably over. So I want to put, first of all, Netanyahu in historical context, both the good and disappointing things about him, both as an Israeli leader and as a kind of international figure. So, Haviv, what do you think? How do you think Netanyahu will be remembered internationally? I mean, sort of historically, both as an Israeli and as an international figure.
It's a fascinating question, Tom. You know, one of the things that makes it difficult to answer is that some of Netanyahu's great successes are in all the things that didn't happen under his rule. Netanyahu has been a very moderate leader, sometimes rhetorically very right-wing, but in practice and in policy, you see that with Gaza, with Iran. There was a lot of saber rattling over the course of the last decade, but in the end, there was no open, kinetic, as they call it, Israeli airstrike on the Iranian nuclear program, which was a real fear of the Obama administration and of many, many commentators during the Trump period. Netanyahu has actually, during the last election campaign 2 months ago, Netanyahu made a point of reminding Israelis that the last decade has been has seen the least number of dead and wounded, right, in Israel's history. Yeah. So it's a very large, very complicated question. One of his great successes might be in just how quiet things have been under his rule.
Yeah, I agree with you. In fact, can I, a lot of people internationally think that Bibi is a, warmonger and an extreme right-winger and so on. And although he does often talk the talk, he really is moderate in many ways, which will surprise people. Even in terms of things like settlement building, it's slowed down. It's been less than his predecessors from the Israeli Labour Party who's led. And he also, to remind people, there's been a war raging in neighbouring Syria for more than 10 years. And Netanyahu has very skillfully avoided getting involved, certainly on the ground, unlike other neighbouring countries of Syria like Turkey and so on, who got dragged into it. So Netanyahu...
I think that's right.
Yeah, and as you say, he has not bombed the Iranian nuclear program in the way that Menachem Begin bombed the Iraqi nuclear program and Ehud Olmert bombed the Syrian nuclear program. So in many respects, Netanyahu is not the extreme right-winger that so many casual observers of the Middle East from outside believe him to be. And as you say,
by the way, the Israeli far right says that all the time, constantly complains. There were many, many periods over the last few years when you saw leaders of West Bank settlements actually camped out in protest tents in front of his office in Jerusalem. So that's something that in the Israeli context, in the Hebrew language discourse, is pretty well known about him. That's a big part of his reputation and I think of his legacy going forward also.
Yeah, before we get on to his character flaws and some of the more negative things about him, also just want to touch on his relations with foreign leaders. I mean, it's remarkable. Israel is a small country of less than 10 million people. And I think at one point, Netanyahu even flew from the White House, having seen the American president, directly to Moscow, where he had a meeting with Putin. And I mean, I don't know that even the British, French or German leaders have ever done something like that. It's incredible. He has close working relationships with a whole array of leaders around the world, including Arab leaders, some of which Israel doesn't have formal peace treaties with. Like, you know, he was in Oman, for example. He met last year the Saudi Crown Prince. He has managed to, on his watch, establish 4 peace treaties in the last year or so with Bahrain, the UAE, and then in sub-Saharan Africa, Arab country Sudan, and then on the far, you know, on the Atlantic coast with Morocco. And he has also established closer working relationships with a bunch of other Arab countries that are not in so much in the public domain. And he also has good relationships with leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, in South America, and some in Europe, you know, the Austrian leaders, the Czech leaders. He's got very close working relationships with them. So it may puzzle outside observers that at this very moment that he's done 4 peace treaties in the last year, he's had what I think pretty much everyone agrees is probably the most successful vaccination campaign against the coronavirus of any country in the world. So Israel is pretty much fully open, whereas half the world is still in various forms of coronavirus lockdown. So why now is Bibi losing power? You know, I know there's a host of reasons, but why don't you name the top ones?
Yeah, you know, as you say, there's a host of reasons because Netanyahu, of course, operates at many different levels of this question, right? There is an Israeli culture war between right and left that has something to do with Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi Jews, has something to do with old party alliances between old, you know, the old Labor and the old Herut, which would become Likud. These are things that still very much percolate through the Israeli system and Israeli political identities. He functions as a soldier of the old Menachem Begin right, opposing an Ashkenazi left-wing elite. That has a lot to do with why roughly 40% of the country that sees itself connected to the Ashkenazi elite of the left. And by the way, a great deal of the Mizrahi right wing is Ashkenazim, and a great deal of the Mizrahi left wing, of the Ashkenazi left wing, is Mizrahim. These are categories in which Israelis think rather than actual demographic truths. But he operates within those deeply Israeli cultural contexts. And there he simply is one side of a very, very generational, very long-running culture war. So that's one answer. The second answer is he's been around.
To interrupt, could it even be that because Netanyahu himself is Ashkenazi, he's from his father was a distinguished historian. He has a very himself, intellectual Ashkenazi. For anyone who doesn't know, Ashkenazi, of course, means Jews of East and Central European origin, slightly under half the Israeli population today, and Mizrahi or Sephardi are Jews from Middle Eastern origin. So sorry, just to clarify that. Could it be that they regard him culturally as a traitor? I mean, he himself is from that very intellectual, and yet his supporters, and he's from a secular background, his supporters are religious, Mizrahi, and the secular Ashkenazi elites, even feel personally aggrieved by the fact he's made an alliance with culturally different sectors of the population.
Right. Well, these are categories set really in the 60s and 70s because the Ashkenazi elite, which back then was quite thoroughly Ashkenazi, had marginalized many of the the Middle Eastern Jews who arrived in large waves of immigration from the founding of Israel, and so they really were not, allowed to even, welcomed into the major left-wing socialist parties of the day of that Ashkenazi elite. And so they made common cause with the Israeli right, which was an Ashkenazi right under Menachem Begin. In the 70s, that alliance becomes explicit and it becomes powerful and mobilizing. And from 1977, Menachem Begin, of course, wins the election, the very first time the Labor Party lost an election. Since then, the Mizrahim have leaned very, very heavily toward Likud. So Netanyahu didn't create the alliance in the sense that Ronald Reagan created new alliances in American politics, but he has certainly been the beneficiary of it, even though, as you say, he is his life story is paradigmatic of the Ashkenazi elite, Nevertheless, it is of the right-wing elite. His father, Ben Zion, the historian, famous historian, lived till past 100. His father was the secretary of Zev Jabotinsky, the sort of spiritual and ideological leader of what would become the Likud party. So he's very much on the right-wing Ashkenazi elite of that old right. He's the son of that old right-wing Ashkenazi elite that made that common cause since the 70s with the Mizrahim.
So just to continue, just to continue the other reasons why Netanyahu is on the cusp of losing power now.
Right. So one very important reason is that he's 12 years in power, and a lot of people are sick of him. There's a phenomenon in American politics called the 6-year itch, where a second-term president in the midterms of the second term, the midterm elections, loses ground in Congress traditionally, simply because it's been 6 long years. And his supporters have a lot of reasons from those 6 years maybe not to be so enthusiastic. And the other side's supporters have a lot of reasons over those 6 years to be more enthusiastic. And you saw that under Clinton and Bush and Obama. And so it's just a general phenomenon in democracies, I think a very healthy one. And the final reason is the reason most mentioned, certainly in the Israeli debate, but it's also a reason that we have to talk about carefully. Benjamin Netanyahu has adopted over the last few years, maybe since 2015, when he won the election that year, a kind of predatory politics that are really new in Israeli history. He has openly warned that Arabs are going to the voting booths in record numbers. And he warned in those words, I mean, Arabs are coming to vote, you better come out to vote for me. He has depicted the other side, the left, as traitors, as a danger to Israel's survival. His supporters, now famous and important media personalities who support him, have openly over the last week discuss the end of Israel that would be represented by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, the two opponents to him, who this very morning might seal up a government that ousts him after 12 years, just quite literally handing Israel to the Iranians. He had a campaign ad in 2015 when he faced Isaac Herzog, who this morning is running for president in a vote in the Knesset. Isaac Herzog was the head of the opposition at the time, head of the Labour Party. And in the 2015 election, he had an ad I haven't seen before, which it showed, those Toyota SUVs with Islamic State fighters inside them, driving into Israel. And the idea of this ad, it would have been a satirical mockery of the Likud campaign if it wasn't the Likud campaign. This is what's going to happen if Isaac Herzog wins. So the campaign has become frenetic, angry, bitter, and just characterizing the left as this terrible, dangerous, demonic thing. That's not him previously. He's, of course, in his government, he's had Yair Lapid in his government. The Labour Party under Ehud Barak was in his government for 4 years, first as Labour Party, then as a splinter of the Labour Party from 2011. He has always been a very moderate man. The policies haven't changed. His policies are moderate policies, as we said earlier. But the rhetoric has become, to secure his position.
Could it be? And one of the things an incoming government is likely to do straight off is to impose term limits like they have in the United States, where, of course, you are only allowed to be president for 8 years. One of the problems, or even the tragedies of Netanyahu, and I see it also when I was growing up in Britain with Margaret Thatcher, is, to cite Machiavelli, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's not to say that Thatcher or Netanyahu are corrupt as such, but they certainly don't want to give up power. And possibly in the United States, if there weren't term limits, every single president would have tried to cling on. It's very hard for them to give up. You saw it also in Britain with Tony Blair. Merkel is not as popular as she once was in Germany. And it's kind of a tragedy for Netanyahu because he's achieved a lot in his term in office, and yet he can't let go, and therefore it's, you know, ending in somewhat in tears, which is a pity for him in a way, having achieved a lot.
It's one of the interesting things is how the Likud has been in power now for 12 straight years, and Netanyahu talks every single day as though he's in the opposition. As though there are all these terrible things the left is doing in this country that I have to win the election in order to defeat. And people are like, you know, we have one of the most centralized and monopoly saturated economies in the OECD, in the developed world. That's on Netanyahu. There are all kinds of problems with the natural gas industry here. We have, you know, all sorts of just 1,000 different things that have not gone well in Israel. Ethnic strife. And he talks as if he's not in power, and he's started to do that recently. That wasn't true in 2015. There's a decay.
Okay, so let me just follow up on two things on that. First of all, you mentioned economics. Now, of course, Bibi, he was, just to remind people, he was prime minister first time from 1996 to 99, and then he came back into office as prime minister 10 years later in 2009. But during those 10 years, at one point, he was a very important finance minister, and he helped reform the Israeli economy in a way that's seen substantial economic growth for Israel in recent years. So I want to just ask you briefly about economics, but also when you say, before I forget, when he says he talks as though he's in the opposition, maybe he's preparing himself now to be in the opposition for another comeback. So if you could just, you know.
Sure. I suspect that when historians look back at his record, they won't remember Iran, and they won't remember a fight with Obama, and they won't remember the things that made the headlines. What I think historians will mark as his legacy, and it is a very positive legacy, not perfect, not completely positive, but nevertheless overall, overwhelmingly, I think, positive, is his economic stewardship of the Israeli economy. In the 90s, in the mid-90s, when he was prime minister, Netanyahu lifted currency controls, which sounds very dry and very boring, but in fact, there were very, very strict limits on the ability to move foreign currency into Israel. I think the limit was something like $10,000 in any single transfer. Well, you can't sell a $3 billion exit to Intel in $10,000 increments. The Israeli economy opened when those currency controls were lifted, among a whole host of reforms. We saw it when he was finance minister in the Sharon government in the early 2000s. He took on himself and absorbed tremendous amount of political anger and protests, and people would walk across Israel as a protest at his cuts to welfare subsidies and child subsidies that sent double-digit percentages of non-working populations to work, including in the ultra-Orthodox community, including among Arab women. He has introduced, I believe about 8 years ago, a negative income tax for Arab mothers, Arab women with children, which means that if they get a job that meets the minimum wage, they get added to that a government stipend of something like a few $100s a month. That itself pushed several tens of thousands of families above the poverty line. So he has been, as an economic steward of the Israeli economy, he's overseen a tremendous success story. One interesting fact, after we've, of course, just had this war in Gaza, the latest round of fighting in Gaza, Hamas took over Gaza in 2007 in a violent coup, not against Israel, but against the Palestinian Authority, of course. In the years between 2007 and 2021, most of which were under a Likud/Netanyahu government, Israel's GDP per capita rose from $25,000 per capita to $45,000 per capita. So he has overseen just a flourishing of the Israeli economy, and a lot of it because of his policies and his ideas.
And of course, that economic growth is a key reason why countries like the United Arab Emirates and others, and China and so on, want to do business with Israel. I mean, so let me just, let me just step back a second, okay? I actually first met Netanyahu when I was still a teenager, already interested in politics, and when when you were about 4 or 5 years old, I think, Haviv. And I met him at a breakfast in the Carlisle Hotel in Manhattan. At the time, my father lived and worked in New York for the New York Times. And my father's close friend, George Weidenfeld, who knew everybody, invited my father and me to join him and Netanyahu for breakfast at the Carlisle Hotel. At the time, Bibi had just started as Israel's ambassador to the UN. And at that time, Netanyahu, and I was a teenager, but I was already keenly interested in politics, he was clearly an extraordinarily sharp mind and very, very impressive person. And over the years, when I started working as a journalist, I've met, many other leaders, Israeli and otherwise. And until today, for all his character flaws and faults, maybe because he can also be a bit of a snake as well as being brilliant, Netanyahu has amazing skills and abilities. In spite of the fact Israel is now on a firmer, stronger footing than it has been historically, it's an incredibly complicated and difficult job. Will those people who hate Netanyahu, of which there are many inside Israel, yet regret not having him in power next time the next crisis comes along, whether with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the United States even, whoever? I mean, with Putin, Netanyahu has an understanding with Putin that has helped Israel protect its border during the Syrian war, as well as various other things. So for all his flaws, is there a possibility that a country like Israel is not Denmark? It needs a very wily and skillful leader to navigate through very, very rough seas. Will Bennett or Lapid or future Likud successors be able to continue Netanyahu's achievements to the same way?
Yeah, well, that is, of course, a critical question for Israel's future. I am of the camp that says nobody is indispensable. And not only is nobody indispensable, Netanyahu rides a lot of Israeli successes that he isn't the cause of. The fundamentals of a country decide how things function. In fact, Netanyahu has done a lot of things wrong, and Israel has flourished despite him. For example, he did cut child subsidies and such in the 90s to the ultra-Orthodox, and that sent a lot of ultra-Orthodox to work and to school. But ever since then, when he's needed them in his coalition, they were not in the Sharon coalition at the time, but when he's needed them in the coalition, their budgets have risen and risen and risen to their seminaries and yeshivas and to non-working populations generally in order to stabilize his coalition. So last year, 2020, because he needed to carry out essentially a political maneuver to wriggle out of the coalition agreement, the rotation agreement he signed with Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party, he didn't pass a state budget for the entirety of 2020, which is an astonishing betrayal of his duty as prime minister. It's the first time in Israel's history that didn't happen. And we've seen just one after another unprecedented breaking with tradition in the bad way by Netanyahu. So this is a man who some of his overarching policy ideas did do tremendous things for Israel. I have to say, Ehud Olmert was prime minister from 2006 to 2009. There was no change in the basic liberal economic policies or government investment in high tech or anything of the sort. And Olmert, of course, gave the order to take out the Syrian nuclear program and had very good relationship with the American president. So the UAE did not sign a normalization agreement with Israel or a peace agreement with Israel because of Benjamin Netanyahu. It signed it because Israel has the economic power to maintain a very, very powerful military, a Mossad. The Mossad is probably second largest and most significant espionage organization in the world, second only to the CIA. It's also extremely expensive. It costs billions every year. Israel has these abilities in facing Iran that other countries in the region do not, and that's worth it to the UAE. That won't change under Bennett or Lapid or Merav Michaeli, the uber feminist. Her whole campaign is feminist. She changes the gender when she speaks. Hebrew, unlike English, has gendered verbs and nouns, and so she is known for very domestic issues.
Yeah.
But she also would maintain that war footing.
Just for anyone who doesn't follow it as closely as us, the rumored incoming coalition, which is from right to left, Michaeli, who Haviv just mentioned, is the leader of the Israeli Labour Party, which is on the left. Bennett is a party, Yamina, which is to the right of Netanyahu's Likud party. Lapid is the leader of the centrist Yesh Atid party. So what we have is a coalition of people from right to left. One thing in common, they think Netanyahu's been in power too long. And I think most of us think that. I mean, it's not healthy for any democracy for someone to stay in power too long. And I think it's probably a tragedy for Netanyahu that he hasn't, navigated his retirement on his own terms, maybe setting up a successor in the Likud. But like many leaders, he's not wanted to give up power. Just finally, because we're almost out of time, Haviv, I know that in addition to being a keen analyst of Israeli politics, you also, although you're Jerusalem born and you still live near Jerusalem, your parents, I think your dad, who I met a couple of times, was a lawyer, but also a rabbi. Your mum was an archaeologist, but she was also involved in Jewish education, also to help with American Jews. So although you're an Israeli-born Jerusalemite, through your parents, you've had some growing up with meeting American Jewish leaders that they met. The Jews are widely regarded as the world's longest surviving people, millennia. Does Netanyahu have a role in the wider Jewish history? Would he be remembered as a significant figure, not just in Israeli history, but in 3,000 or 4,000 years of Jewish history?
The short answer is I don't know. David Ben-Gurion is an easy one. He declared the state of Israel. Levi Eshkol was the man who carefully navigated very dangerous shoals and oversaw the victory of 67 and was fundamental to that victory. But he was also a quiet, Yiddish-speaking, unassuming sort of politician, and people don't remember that he played a huge role in saving Israel from destruction. Netanyahu, I think, is more on the Levi Eshkol camp. We're so worked up emotionally now about the man because that he is the pivot of Israeli politics today and of a lot of the American-Israeli relationship that matters so much to American Jews, who are, of course, something like 80% of all diaspora Jews. But in the long scheme of things, Netanyahu, I suspect, is going to be remembered as a competent steward who navigated Israel through some difficult times, didn't, declare a state. Of course, some of that depends on how the Iran portfolio turns out. If Iran drops a nuke that detonates 500 yards above the, Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's legacy will be as the Churchill who wasn't listened to. And if the Biden administration is right on the Iran deal and everything goes well for the Middle East from now on, I think Netanyahu will be largely forgotten.
By the way, my own sense is one of the reasons he wanted to cling on to power in recent months and the last year or two is that he was hoping to get a wider peace treaty with the Arab world, in particular with Saudi Arabia, and possibly had Trump stayed in power, it might have made it easier because Trump had relations with the Saudis more than Biden seems to. And I think that he would have got a bigger place in historical records if he had a wider peace treaty with the Arab world, but it seems that it won't be, not under Netanyahu. And I tend to agree with you that he may not be remembered. Historically, he may not have a particularly major part in the history books. So
yes,
yes,
it's sort of it's sort of anticlimactic to end that way. But even if he lasts another 3 years in power, because Bennett and Lapid failed to put together a coalition in the next hour, I agree with you.
Well, let me just throw one more spanner in the works. His father, who you mentioned, lived until 102 and was pretty fit till the end. Netanyahu is 71, so that's more than 30 years. an incoming government may fall apart. Netanyahu may cling on as a leader of the opposition. And just as he came back in 1999, after he left office in 1999, he said, I'll be back. Not impossible that he'll be back. I don't think he will, but it's not impossible that he'll come back again. So maybe we're not seeing
the way he's leaving is causing so much trauma and anger on the right. There's so much frustration. If Netanyahu agreed right now to step down, the right would have a 65-seat coalition, and it would be a right-wing coalition. And he's refused because he thinks that it's about him staying in power and not the movement. He has good reason for feeling that. He believes that he's surrounded by political, less impressive people than him, and thinks that he is a great statesman, and without him, Israel will face all the things he says in the campaign. Israel will be destroyed if someone else is prime minister, which are things that he's just openly said. So I think there's a lot of anger on the right. Take a look for a second at the Israeli Knesset today. You have a party called Israel Beitenu, led by a man named Avigdor Lieberman. Avigdor Lieberman was one of Netanyahu's most important political aides in the 90s, who was his director general of the prime minister's office in Netanyahu's first run as prime minister, and now runs a party whose number one campaign promise was Netanyahu will fall. You have Naftali Bennett, who was set to be sworn in as prime minister, who was once Netanyahu's chief of staff. You have Moshe Kachlon in the last Knesset led a party called Kulanu, which took 10% of parliament in the election, and was a Likud minister who fled Likud because of Netanyahu. Netanyahu has seeded the opposition with former Likudniks who couldn't stand him. So there's
Gideon Saar, another party.
And Gideon Saar, of course. Who ran on one promise, which was, I won't stay with Netanyahu, and has kept that promise. Netanyahu would have to return under conditions that are unpleasant. We should remember that David Ben-Gurion once left and then came back. And the man who founded the state, the man who led parties with 50 seats in the 120-seat parliament, with unprecedented numbers since. Those numbers haven't been matched by anyone since. When he came back, he won 3 seats in an election. So I suspect there is no comeback in him.
No, I agree with you. Okay, well, we'll see what happens. Okay, Haviv, we're out of time, but great chatting with you, and speak soon.
Yeah, thanks for talking, Ty.
Bye. Bye.